Welcome to this session on cyber operations and international law. Before we commence with the session, I have a small administrative announcement to make. Right after this session, there will be a very short prize draw for our little competition on the Cyber Law Toolkit panel. So please hang around for a while after the session is over. And with this, I will introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Anna Maria Osula, a senior policy officer at Guardtime, senior researcher and lecturer at the Tallinn University of Technology, and a former legal researcher at the NATO CCD COE, where she did research on national cybersecurity strategies, international organizations, international criminal cooperation, and law. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Tomasz, for the kind introduction, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to the most exciting panel of CyCon.
There we go.
To get the spirit right. I'm very excited to be here moderating this panel with the distinguished speakers. I've been involved with CyCon for almost 10 years, always affiliated to NATO CCD COE, so this is my first year to be here on stage without the affiliation. A bit nostalgic, but also very exciting. And I'm very happy to be moderating exactly this panel because I think the topic of sovereignty and cyber operations is one of the most compelling issues, and not only for lawyers, but also for strategy and policy people alike. And we have three very good speakers on stage. We will follow, so that we start with Professor Mike Schmidt, then go on to Dr. Barry Sander, and then we will finish up with Dr. Przemysław Roguski. And we start with Mike, and I think he really doesn't need any introduction, but for those of you who don't know him, then he's like the supernova of the galaxy of international lawyers or something like this. I hope supernova does him justice. And he is working for the University of Exeter and the US Naval War College, but most of you perhaps know him as the managing director or the general director for the Tallinn manuals. And he will share with us the classic approach to sovereignty, and we will get to this, the less classic interpretations during his presentation and also later during the questions. So thank you, Mike, for being here once again, and please, the stage is yours.
So it's certainly great to be back here. You know, you've been coming too long. I flew in from Israel last night. I've been on the road for 5 weeks, and they gave me my card, and I just checked. Her card says Guardtime and probably says a university, and they're cadets from West Point. It probably says the United States Military Academy. They gave me a card that says 1956, my birth date. I think I've been coming too long, at any rate. So we're going to talk about sovereignty in cyberspace. This is the #1 topic in the field right now in terms of state action. I've just been down with the OAS, and then I went from there to the ASEAN States, Association of Southeast Asia, and this is the topic that everyone is struggling with, and I'll explain why in just a moment. What I'd like to do is start by referencing what every international lawyer who writes an article on this issue talks about. Every single article on this issue contains this statement. It is from the island of Palmas, and it's very clear. It explains sovereignty. Sovereignty is the right of a state to do on its territory what it wishes to do to the exclusion of other states. To the exclusion of other states, and that's the critical issue. Now, states do not seem to have felt that this does not apply in cyberspace. It was the general consensus of all the states I've talked to since I've been working in this field that in cyberspace, there is sovereignty, and indeed, this is what the UNGGE said in their 2013 report and in their very important 2015 report. So over and over again, we see states concurring that sovereignty applies in cyberspace. So what I'll do in the beginning is talk about how sovereignty applies in cyberspace, and then I'll spend a little time talking about the debate and giving you my personal position on the issue. First of all, sovereignty is a rule of law that applies only to states. Now, it may apply to actions of non-state actors like terrorists or hacktivists, when those actions are attributable to states as a matter of law. That typically occurs when those non-state actors, those groups, are acting under the instructions, direction, or control of a state. There is one state which has taken this even further and argues that even if you cannot attribute the actions of the non-state actor, a terrorist group in this case, to a state, nevertheless, cyber operations conducted by that non-state group may, in some circumstances, violate sovereignty. That's pretty clear. In terms of sovereignty, there are two ways you may violate the rule of sovereignty. The first is pretty simple. Sovereignty is about territory. We are on sovereign Estonian territory. It is crystal clear that Estonia controls access to this territory, that its borders are inviolable. However, in the cyber context, the question we must ask ourselves is, yeah, but what about a remote cyber operation, a cyber operation from outside Estonia that comes into Estonia and has effects that manifest in Estonia? In the Tallinn Manual Group, we said that there is no doubt whatsoever, not a scintilla of doubt, that if a remote cyber operation causes physical effects or injury in this country, that's a violation of this country's sovereignty, so long as those actions are attributable to a state. We went a step further and said even when you don't have physical damage, if you have functional damage, then that's a violation of sovereignty too. In other words, the cyber infrastructure, it quits working. Now, if it quits working, then there's broad consensus that is in fact a violation of the rule of sovereignty. The question which is unanswered, which we could not answer, which I don't know the answer to, is what about situations in which there's interference with functionality, but it's not permanent, it's not broken, because I don't care whether you hit my laptop with a hammer or with malware. If it doesn't work, it's a paperweight. The effects are the same. But what about a situation where it simply slows down? Or a situation where it doesn't do what it's intended to do? I type M, it hits L. What about these situations? Unclear. Unclear in international law. And also unclear in international law is a situation in which there is no impact on functionality, but nevertheless, the effects are harmful, and an example would be the deletion of data. Is this a violation of sovereignty? Well, we're waiting for states to opine on this issue. In our view, this is where the play should be for states. We did agree that espionage is not itself a violation of sovereignty, but the way in which you conduct it may in some cases be a violation. So to give you a few examples, close access operations, stick something in the USB port. Clearly, that would be a violation because it requires someone to do it on the territory of your state. Violation of sovereignty. Causing permanent damage by causing a system to overheat. Sovereignty violation. Rendering the disks inoperable because they are encrypted. If it's permanent, sovereignty violation. If it's temporary, I don't know the answer to the question. Remotely being inside the system, causing it to slow down, I don't know. I'm waiting for states to opine on this issue. Putting malware in a system, I don't know. We're waiting for states to opine on exactly where that line of breach of sovereignty occurs. Well, what about operating inside the system? Well, the mere fact you're inside another state system, I'm not so sure that's a violation of sovereignty, and it certainly is not a violation if all you're doing is probing for open ports, looking for vulnerabilities, and so forth. So that's the first way you may violate sovereignty, has to do with territory. The second way you violate sovereignty has to do with what governments do. Remember, the exclusive functions of a state. So if one state interferes with the inherently governmental functions, a legal term, inherently governmental functions of another state, or usurps those functions, then it has violated the first state's sovereignty. What do we mean by inherently governmental functions? Those things that states and only states do, like hold elections, like collect taxes. So to take two examples, when is it interference? if I conduct a DDoS operation, even if there is no damage whatsoever. But it interferes with the collection of the taxes, violation of sovereignty. Usurp another state's functions, inherently governmental functions, I conduct a law enforcement operation to bring down a botnet structure, infrastructure in another state without that state's consent. I have performed law enforcement on the territory of another state which enjoyed the exclusive right to perform that function. I will tell you, I've been around doing this for quite some time. Most of us never doubted this at all. And in fact, in 1999, the US Department of Defense released a very important assessment on international law and cyberspace, where the Department of Defense took the position that sovereignty applies in cyberspace. That if you cause effects on another state's territory, it implicates the rule of sovereignty. So at this point, everything is hunky-dory until May of 2018. In May of 2018, something very important happens. The then Attorney General of the United Kingdom, Jeremy Wright, comes out with a statement at Chatham House talking about the UK position on international law. And it's an important position, it's an important statement because he serially goes through lots of issues like attribution and state responsibility and use of force and self-defense. And time after time, he's hitting right in the middle of consistent and concurrent state practice. So I applaud the statement because it's a great statement. It shows the courage of a state in setting forth its legal position, and most states have not done so to date. However, there is one paragraph in there that sparks a debate in the international community, and it has to do with sovereignty. And what Jeremy Wright tells us is that for the United Kingdom, sovereignty is not a rule that may be violated. It's a broad principle of international law from which other rules, like the rule prohibiting the use of force or the rule prohibiting intervention in the internal affairs of another state, it's the source of those rules, but it's not a rule in itself. If the United Kingdom conducts a cyber operation into another country, you may never say it has violated the sovereignty of that nation. Well, that was a shock to the international law system. We began a dialogue that continues to this day. So what I'd like to do in the remaining time is test the premise. Was Jeremy right? Was the United Kingdom correct in arguing that there's no such thing as a rule of sovereignty? Well, it would appear, in my view, that they were wrong, very, very wrong, if you look at past judicial treatment and past state practice in this area. For example, and I'll go through these quickly, Lees v. Hull, who many of you know, and I have written a long article, 32 pages long, in the Texas Law Review, where we have page after page after page after page of examples of states taking the position that sovereignty may be violated. So here are some of them. Perhaps most important for this discussion is the 1926 Lotus case, which was before the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor to the International Court of Justice. There, in a case involving Turkey and France, the court said, listen, there is a rule of sovereignty. You may not exercise your power in another state's territory. Rule of sovereignty. And if there is any situation that permits such an intrusion, there will be an express rule of international law providing that case, providing that fact. In 1949, we now have the International Court of Justice, and in its very first case, sovereignty is the key. And it finds that the United Kingdom violated the sovereignty of Albania by minesweeping in Albanian waters. So we have the Permanent Court of Justice laying down the rule, and we start seeing the court, the World Court, applying this in case after case. It applies it again in 1974 in a famous case called nuclear tests. It had to do with Australia complaining about French nuclear tests and the fact that radiation or radioactive material would float into Australian territory. The court dismissed the case on other grounds. It's not important why, but the court found that sovereignty applied in this case. If one state causes effects in another state, the rule of sovereignty is implicated. 1986, perhaps the most famous case before the International Court of Justice, Nicaragua and the United States. The United States was doing some rather strange stuff in Nicaragua, mining harbors, arming, training guerrillas, financing guerrillas. They even produced a manual on how to assassinate someone. Of course, Nicaragua complained more than a little, took it to the International Court of Justice, and the court held that the U.S. action was a violation of sovereignty. And this is very important because the Brits argue that there's this principal sovereignty from which intervention emerges and from which the use of force emerges. But in this case, the ICJ says they are three separate violations of international law. There is a distinct and separate rule of international law. And then mountains of state practice. The Israelis in the 1960s, the Israelis roll into Argentina and grab a Nazi war criminal, Eichmann, bring him back to try him in Israel. The UN Security Council, remember, which includes the United States and Russia and China. The United States Security Council condemns the action as a violation of sovereignty. Indeed, when the case arises in the District Court of Jerusalem, the District Court of Jerusalem also finds this to have been a violation of sovereignty. Then, in 1978, a Soviet satellite breaks up, Cosmos 954 breaks up, re-enters the atmosphere over Canada. Canada complains, "You've just violated my sovereignty. You've just caused effects on my territory." And Canada won, and there was an agreement on reparations and so forth. 2001, a U.S. and Chinese aircraft hit each other over international waters. The U.S. aircraft has to penetrate Chinese airspace to land. China says, "You violated our sovereignty." The United States does not protest. The United States says, "Yes, but we had a legal right to do so because there is a special rule that is called the rule of distress." Remember when I was talking about the first case before the PCIJ, the Lotus case? General rule of sovereignty, but here we have a special exception. We conduct drone operations. The Americans conduct drone operations in Pakistan. Pakistan complains, so do other states, on the basis of violation of sovereignty. The United States does not say we did not violate your sovereignty. The United States says there's a special rule. That's the rule of self-defense. We don't contest the violation of sovereignty. Russia invades Ukraine, and Russia conducts activities in Georgia. The West condemns it as what? A violation of sovereignty, in addition to a use of force and other violations. In 2006, Iran captures U.S. sailors that were in a riverine craft that had made its way, got lost, made its way into Iranian waters. They claim you violated our sovereignty. We had the right to grab those sailors. Answer from the United States, you're right. We apologize and thank you for giving those sailors back. State Department legal advisor Harold Koh says sovereignty applies in cyberspace in a very important speech at U.S. Cybercom in 2012, in which he sets forth the U.S. position on international law in cyberspace. A few years later, his successor, Brian Egan, does exactly the same at a speech at Berkeley, says the same thing. Sovereignty applies in cyberspace. You see sovereignty in treaties. The Treaty on Transnational Organized Crime contains an express rule that says that one state may not conduct law enforcement operations in another state. Why? Because it would violate the sovereignty of that state. Sovereignty is mentioned in core treaties like the Organization of American States Charter, and the United Nations General Assembly has and Security Council over and over and over and over again said that there is a rule of sovereignty and has said it is violated in certain cases. It would appear crystal clear that the United Kingdom is wrong on this point. I want to emphasize, I applaud the United Kingdom for coming out and setting forth its position and what I believe is correct in every other aspect. But here they are wrong, and their error comes with a cost. It comes with a cost because it makes it difficult for states adopting this position to name and shame. Now, I work with international relations people a lot, and they say, "Oh, naming and shaming, it's not." Hey, every time a state conducts an unlawful activity, whether in cyberspace or not, they justify that activity on the basis of international law. If international law did not matter, they would not do so. And so this creates a bind for states taking this position. Very important. In October 2018, GCHQ issues a press release condemning the Russians for lots of violations of international law in cyberspace, for exfiltrating data, for damaging cyber infrastructure, for gaining unauthorized access. Unlawful, 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 unlawful. But where's the beef? If you take sovereignty off the table, exactly what did the Russians violate? Because it's very difficult to get to the level of a violation of the principle of non-intervention. And it's really difficult in cyberspace to say one state used force against another. If sovereignty is not a rule, there is no basis for the British condemnation of most of the Russian activities. You've heard in this conference from the president of this nation, by the way, about countermeasures. Countermeasures are activities that would normally be unlawful, but for the fact they're designed to get the other side to knock off its unlawful activities. Well, if that's the case, if sovereignty is not a violation of international law, then the victim state will not have the right to take countermeasures. The advocates of this position say, hey, don't worry. Because sovereignty is not violated by is never violated by cyber activities, that means we can respond in cyberspace without violating international law ourselves. But they've forgotten an important point. Countermeasures need not be in kind. What if you're a state that lacks offensive cyber capability and you want to respond to this violation to impose pain on the other side to make them stop? I'm not sure what the offensive cyber capabilities of this country are. I'm sure they are not hugely robust. Russia conducts cyber operations against Estonia. What will Estonia want to do? Maybe a countermeasure in cyberspace, but maybe close the water line off the coast to innocent passage by Russian vessels. You may now not pass through our territorial waters, even though you had a right to do under the law of the sea. Maybe Estonia will close the airspace. Russian civil aircraft that are on unscheduled service have a right just to fly into Estonia. Chicago Convention. But it would be entirely appropriate for Estonia to say, sorry, you're violating our sovereignty, and so we're closing our airspace until you stop. Now, those measures have been taken off the table. And then there's the rule of due diligence, which says the state has an obligation not to allow its territory to be used for activities that are adverse to the interest of another state with regard to its rights under international law. So now, again, I'll pick on Russia. Russians unaffiliated with the state, or we can't get attribution, conduct operations against Estonia. If there's sovereignty, then Estonia may be able to say, hey, Russia, you're in breach of your due diligence obligation. Make them stop because you have a legal obligation to do so. And if you do not, we will take countermeasures, like no more ships in our waters lying off our coast. But if there's no sovereignty, then you cannot complain that the Russians are violating their obligation, because the obligation of due diligence only applies when there's a legal rule that is being violated. And finally, I would say that taking this position is problematic because it hobbles credibility, it hobbles deterrence, and it hobbles escalation. The West has accused, correctly so, by the way, Russia and China of cherry-picking in international law. This rule we like. We like this sovereignty thing because it gives us lots of control over what happens on our territory. Well, with self-defense, we don't want to mention that in a GGE report. International humanitarian law? No, not so fast with international humanitarian law. Correctly accused of cherry-picking. But if we start doing the same, we lose our credibility, and we will undercut the rule of law in the international community. Moreover, deterrence is about imposing costs. I can impose cost if you take a particular action. But as I've explained, this sovereignty is not a rule approach, takes lots and lots and lots of potential cost I could impose on a bad actor, a bad state. Off the table, deterrence is weakened. And the risk of escalation goes up, because now international law does not intervene early on to say, knock it off. International law only intervenes when the cyber operations are very, very, very severe. Intervention is a hard standard to meet. And what this means is this rule allows lots and lots of hostile cyber operations going back and forth between states without those operations being unlawful. What the people who take this position have forgotten is that international law is robust. It does not leave states defenseless. In the face of hostile cyber operations, there are lots of things you can do. You do not need to claim there is no sovereignty so you can take robust responses. You may engage in retortion. You may engage in countermeasures. You may engage based upon the plea of necessity, and should the cyber operation against you rise to the level of an armed attack, you may engage in self-defense. To those who would claim they need a rule of no sovereignty to provide a robust defense of their cyberspace, I would say, give me the situation where international law does indeed keep you defenseless. And I would suggest there are very, very few of those situations. So in conclusion, bravo to the Brits for having the courage to be one of the first states to set forth their policy, and set forth their policy in a way that has pinpoint accuracy, except for this one point. And this is a very, very dangerous trend we are seeing. And with that, I will stop and turn to my next panelist.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this compelling and passionate presentation. And especially, I think the key takeaway for non-lawyers, for policy people and strategy people should be that without having sovereignty as a rule, this really takes away the ability for states to respond under international law using, for example, countermeasures, or gives away the possibility to apply the principle of due diligence to a large extent. So thank you, Mike, for this. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience, but before we do so, let me ask the first question myself. On the previous days, we have talked a lot about cyber operations that may cause friction among allies. And there was especially a good presentation by Max Sweets, where he described the activities or the alleged activities of the US Cyber Command. And the scenario that he rolled out was that what if the Cyber Command of State A targets the networks of State B, which is its ally, because in the networks of State B, there is a certain part of the network that is under the control of an adversary, State C, and that State C is using that part of the network for malicious activities, for launching malicious attacks against State A, where the Cyber Command is. And let's assume that those activities are, for example, deleting content, changing passwords, and the like. So I know you briefly mentioned this type of a scenario in your presentation, but how would you comment on this? Would you say that in this case, this Cyber Command is breaching the sovereignty of its ally? And in this scenario, we assume that there is no direct consent for such activity from the ally.
Well, that's a complicated scenario. I would need a lot more facts to give you a definitive answer, but in the broadest sense, the answer appears fairly simple. It's an ally. So you go to the ally and you ask for consent to bring down the malicious activity. In the event the state does not grant its consent, that state is probably in breach of its due diligence obligation. Because it's in breach of its due diligence obligation, it is breaching an obligation to you, which allows you to take countermeasures. And so you may then, whether it's a breach of sovereignty or not, you may then go into those systems, thereby violating the sovereignty of the state that you're acting into, your ally, State B, and bring down those systems yourself as a form of countermeasure, not against the bad actors, not against State C, but has a form of countermeasure against state B for its failure to comply with its due diligence obligation. So I would see not a lot of issues here.
But this is the case when state B does not give the consent, but what if the state B is not asked for it? If it's a unilateral activity?
Okay, well, state B should be asked.
Okay.
That's easy.
Okay.
And since it's your ally, you should be nice. Okay.
Okay, that's good. So it kind of works well with what Max was saying in his speech, that without asking for such consent or without exchange of communication about these operations, it can really cause frictions amongst the relationships of the allies. Now,
I would say, so the president, I wasn't here, but I read the speech this morning. The president made a very important point with regard to countermeasures, collective countermeasures. One of the things, and I support her, but one of the things that countermeasures is that there's a requirement of notice. And so if you're going to take a countermeasure, if I want to make you stop something, I have to say, listen, if you don't stop, I'm going to make you stop. In the UK statement, the UK said that there's no obligation to do that. That's a position, and that's despite the fact that the general rule is that I got to say, hey, knock it off, and if you don't knock it off, I'm going to do this bad thing to you to cause you to. What the Brits said with regard to that was the rule of notice doesn't make much sense. The requirement of notice doesn't make much sense in cyberspace, because if I'm placing you on notice, well, then you're going to take measures that will defeat my countermeasure in advance. That's a position we took in the Tala manual, and that's why it's so very important that states come out and say what their actions are, what their position on international law is. So this is sort of a variant on countermeasures that should not be missed at the conference.
okay, great. Do I see a sea of hands for questions? Let's start first with here, and the second question, the gentleman over there.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding the temporary functional damage that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation. Could it be compared to a violation of airspace, which is also temporary, and why not? Could we use the same standard or not?
And let's take the second question just right after, and then Mike can answer both of them. The gentleman here. Yeah.
Professor Schmidt, thank you for your presentation. I was mesmerized by your last sentence, really, because I was under the impression that the UK position was a singular one. And your last sentence mentioned a trend. Could you elaborate on that?
So let me take the first question first. Once you have a violation of airspace, everyone agrees that the sovereignty violation has already occurred, that the damage has already occurred. The question with regard to the temporary, your argument makes sense, okay? It's just that states have not come to that conclusion yet. And so I just spoke on this in Israel. When we were doing the Tala manual, we were extraordinarily conservative because we did not want to get out ahead of states. I would suspect that some states will say that if you have a temporary disruption, depending on the severity of that disruption, the consequences, the effect, that would also qualify as a violation of sovereignty. And they would, and I think your argument about the temporary violation of airspace, because if a jet pops in and pops out, it's still a violation of airspace, would be an argument that they would look to. We just felt uncomfortable going that far because of the unique nature of cyberspace. With regard to the second question, yeah, there is a trend. So I travel around and talk to states a lot. I'm involved in a project with the Dutch and the Australians and Singapore and the United States to train government officials. The trend started with the Americans when Colonel Gary Cord, who's a very dear friend of mine, a real smart guy, published a paper, a blog actually, and then subsequently a paper arguing that there is no such thing as a violation of the rule of sovereignty. He was joined by Bob Taylor, who was a recently retired, very senior person in the Department of Defense, and then the then General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense produced a paper which took exactly the same position. That paper was distributed to the combatant commands. It went viral. It was unclassified. It went viral and was subsequently classified. So I can't talk about the specifics, but we at least see the trend in the Department of Defense. tracking exactly what the Brits did in the May 2018 statement. When I travel around, states are really conflicted on this, and in great part it's because many states rely upon the United Kingdom for a lot. The United Kingdom is a very powerful country. And then with regard to the United States, many countries are really wondering what the US is going to do. The US has not taken a position on the issue, but states are jumping to the conclusion that our position is consistent with the British position because the DoD came out and made these various statements. So I guess I misspoke myself. There is certainly a trend in the United States. There is an express statement in the UK. And as I talk to officials from Colombia to Thailand, they're scratching their heads wondering what they should be doing.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And let's turn to now our next speaker, Dr. Barry Sander, from doing his postdoc at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. And Dr. Sander is doing his research mostly on global cybersecurity norms, human rights and technology, and international criminal law. And the presentation will be on a very interesting topic that also Mike touched upon, the silence of states in giving their legal assessments. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anna Maria. And let me begin by saying what a privilege it is to be at CyCon. This is my first CyCon. Frankly, it's my first time in Estonia at all. I've had a fantastic time. The debates have been extremely high level. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and a particular shout out to Thomas Minarik, who in my hour of need not only found me speaker cards, but also found me nice CCD COE branded speaker cards, which I was very excited about. The title of my talk today is The Sound of Silence, International Law and the Governance of Peacetime Cyber Operations. And my point of departure really is an observation. And the observation is that recent years have witnessed rising anxieties concerning the silence of states with respect to how international law applies in the cyber domain. And over the past few days, for those of you who attended the other law panels, I think these anxieties or frustrations have been somewhat apparent. And in particular, it's been anxieties over silence concerning peacetime, the applicability of international law to peacetime cyber operations, by which I mean those which are below the threshold of use of force and occur outside the context of an armed conflict. Now, the silence of states, according to the conventional narrative, has manifested itself in at least 4 different forms. So first, there are a lack of cyber-specific multilateral treaties, and there seems to be a reluctance on the part of states, or lack of interest, to enter into new ones. There also seems to be a reluctance on the part of states to come out and clarify their position concerning how existing customary international law applies in the cyber domain, with, of course, notable exceptions, one of which formed the topic of Mike's speech. Thirdly, some scholars have pointed to the fact that states have begun to talk about non-binding voluntary norms of cybersecurity, in cyberspace, responsible behavior in cyberspace. That shift itself represents a shift away from the vocabulary of international law. Now, that's obviously a contested statement, but there are people who suggest that. And finally, the silence of states is also apparent in the propensity of certain states to name the involvement of other states in hostile cyber operations, but then studiously avoid shaming them with recourse to the vocabulary of international law. Again, there are some exceptions to that. So that's the conventional narrative. Now, I don't argue in my paper that this is necessarily inaccurate, but I do argue that it is somewhat incomplete. It's not the whole story. And what I argue is, for greater specificity, when we look at the silence of states concerning the applicability of international law, how international law applies to cyberspace. And my point of departure for that is to, first of all, distinguish different types of peacetime cyber operations. So first, you have peacetime cyber attacks. These are acts of state or non-state actors attributable to state, which use cyber capabilities to alter, disrupt, degrade, or destroy computer systems or the information resident in them. Essentially, these are destructive cyber operations. Then you have peacetime cyber espionage operations. These are acts of state or non-state actors attributable to a state, which clandestinely or under false pretenses use cyber capabilities to copy information from closed as opposed to open sources. So essentially, we're talking about information gathering operations. And finally, we have peacetime cyber information operations. And these are acts of state or non-state actors attributable to a state, which clandestinely or under false pretenses use cyber capabilities to deploy information to influence political sentiment in another state. Now, obviously, in reality, any cyber operation in the real world may have various aspects of each of these. But for the purposes of legal analysis, it is useful to distinguish them. And that's why I've defined these types of cyber operation by defining them according to their underlying acts. So what I do in the paper is I take each of these different types of cyber operations, and then I look at the purported silence of states in relation to those cyber operations. And I try to really show that state silence is not uniform, but varies according to at least one of three questions. So first, what are the targets of the state silence? Are state silence about international law in general, or only in relation to particular rules of international law, or particular aspects? What is the scope of state silence? Are all states silent on a particular issue, or only particular groupings of states? And finally, what are the rationales? What are the potential, I have to hypothesize here because there's not too much in the public domain, but what are the possible rationales behind state silences in different contexts? What are the possible technical, political, and legal reasons behind state silence? And I argue that by doing this deconstruction of state silence, it reveals an important dimension of the politics of international law, and also enables a more nuanced evaluation of the appropriateness of silence in different contexts. Okay, so that's the basic aim of the paper. So let's begin with peacetime cyberattacks. Now, if you review the peacetime cyberattacks that have made the public record, and I'm sure there are many that haven't, but those that have, then we can distinguish a number of different situations. First, there are situations, and this can change over time, of course, but you have situations where states have been silent about whether a cyber incident resulted from an accident or a cyber attack. And here I give the example of Stuxnet, because it was not immediately clear to Iran whether the problems that it had with its nuclear facilities were the result of an external attack or simply failures of its internal operating teams. That was, of course, the point, but nonetheless resulted in silence on that issue for some time. Secondly, we have situations where it's clear there's been an attack that reaches the public domain, but states fail to attribute that attack to another state and also decline to declare whether any response measures have been taken. And here I would give the example of the Shamoon malware, which was deployed against Saudi Arabian and Qatari private and public sector targets between 2012 and 2017, which to date have not been attributed officially or publicly to another state, and no non-covert response measures have been taken. Third situation is where a state will identify a cyber attack, attribute that attack to another state, may even take some response measures, but will decline to define that attack as a violation of international law. And here we have the example of the Sony hack. So this involved the deployment of destructive malware, which caused tens of millions of dollars of damage to Sony's computer infrastructure. The US was willing to attribute that attack to North Korea, but Secretary of State Kerry was only willing to define the attack as a flagrant disregard of international norms. And President Obama used the famous phrase that the attack was an act of cyber vandalism, a term with no clear legal connotation. And finally, you have situations where a state identifies a cyber attack, attributes it to another state, takes response measures, declares that there has been a violation of international law, but then does not tell us which rules of international law have been violated. And here we have the example which Michael Schmidt mentioned in his presentation of the UK exposing, together with its allies, exposing operations of Russian military intelligence, some of which included destructive cyber attacks. And the UK was only willing to declare this, it was willing to attribute it to Russia, but it declared that the pattern of behavior was a flagrant violation of international law without going the step further of specifying which rules had been violated. Okay, so what's going on here? What are the possible rationales behind these different types, these different targets of state silence? Well, we can divide them into two. So if we look at the failure to publicly identify, attribute, or respond to a cyber attack, one factor may simply be evidential. The state may lack the evidence to either identify that an attack has occurred, or it may lack evidence to attribute that attack, whether it's attributing it to a computer, a person, or ultimately the state. Each of those steps, it may lack evidence at each stage. The second set of reasons are political. A state may fear that attributing an attack to another state may escalate the situation. It may disrupt ongoing diplomatic efforts in other issue areas completely unrelated. It may even be able to use the threat of attributing publicly in private to that other state, may use that threat privately in order to gain some strategic advantage. Or it may simply conclude that it has inadequate response measures, and therefore publicizing, publicly attributing the attack is essentially self-defeating. Now, when it comes to failing to publicly explain whether a violation has taken place of international law, and in particular which rules have been violated, we might be able to point to various factors at play. First, the state, rightly or wrongly, may believe that international law is simply inadequate. It's not worth it. It's not worth claiming there's a violation. For example, a state may believe that the limits that are placed on countermeasures, such as the notice and proportionality requirements, mean that they're just not worth, it's just not worth referring to international law in this context. Retortion can be taken in any case without declaring a violation of international law. Secondly, there may be disagreements either within a particular state or between states on what the law is on a particular, in response to a particular situation, particularly when states are formulating a collective response. This may lead to silence on which particular rule has been violated. And relatedly, states may be torn between a restrictive desire, an offensive desire for permissive rules in cyberspace, and a defensive desire for restrictive rules in cyberspace, which may lead them, in the UK's case, for example, to simply state that there's been a violation of international law, but not go further and state what that violation is. So those are some of the rationales, and that's our first issue area, peacetime cyber attacks. Turning to cyber espionage. Now, traditionally, espionage, the approach that states have taken, has been to criminalize espionage at the domestic level and be silent as to the legality of espionage operations under international law. But with the advent of cyberspace, the espionage landscape has been transformed to some extent. It's now easier to remotely access enormous volume of information, and non-state actors are now implicated in cyber espionage operations to an unprecedented degree, particularly with respect to state surveillance programs and the bulk collection of personal data. In this environment, under increasing pressure from civil society groups and companies, states have begun to be more vocal about the legality of cyber espionage. But not all states and not all rules. So here we can draw a distinction, and I draw on the work of Ashley Deeks in making this argument. We can draw a distinction between rules that protect the rights of states, such as state sovereignty, and rules that protect the rights of individuals, such as human rights law. So when it comes to rules protecting the rights of states, states continue to adopt a policy of silence in relation to cyber espionage operations. For example, in response to the Snowden disclosures in 2013, only a small minority came out and declared that the activities of the NSA and its allies constituted a violation of state sovereignty, Brazil being one of those minority. By contrast, there has been much more noise on the international arena concerning the compatibility of cyber espionage operations with rules that protect the rights of individuals, such as international human rights law. And we see this not only in statements made after the Snowden disclosures. There's also been a number of UN General Assembly resolutions and Human Rights Council resolutions on the right to privacy in the digital age. And perhaps most importantly, there's also been a number of cases brought before international human rights bodies and regional human rights courts where the court has actually examined these types of activities. So, for example, the recent case of Big Brother Watch and the UK at the European Court of Human Rights offers an example of that. So what's going on here? Why the silence in relation to state-focused rules compared to individual-focused rules? Well, for one thing, there is more external pressure to comply with human rights law. There's more pressure from civil society groups, there are courts involved, there's just more going on in relation to human rights law. Secondly, it's easier to ignore the state-focused rules. It's quite unpalatable for a state to openly avow that it's not complying with human rights law, even in its surveillance operations. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think states have realized that they can quite happily comply with international human rights law and still have quite an extensive espionage surveillance program. Whereas were they to claim that espionage programs violated, for example, state sovereignty, that would constitute a major inhibition on their operations, a major restriction. Okay, so that's our second category, cyber espionage operations. Okay, we turn to the final one, which is cyber information operations. Now, with the rise of social media, information operations have obviously become increasingly prevalent. We all know of the Russian disinformation and trolling campaign in the 2016 US presidential election. Now, since the international regulation of cyber information operations necessarily embroils states in issues of defining the boundaries of freedom of expression, given the contentiousness of that area, it's unsurprising that there is division of approach on how states have approached that question. So here we have one cluster of states, including China, Russia, and other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, who have been highly vocal regarding the international regulation of information operations under the banner of information security. For example, in the draft International Code of Conduct for Information Security submitted to the UN General Assembly in 2011, that provided for curbing the dissemination of information that undermines other countries' political, economic, and social stability, as well as their spiritual and cultural environment. By contrast, a separate set of states have been much more reticent to discuss the international legal regulation of information operations at the multilateral level, and I include here the US and the EU. Generally, they prefer to focus on narrower technical security threats under the banner of cybersecurity. Why? Well, I think one of the reasons, at least, is fear that entering into a kind of international legal dialogue would only serve to help legitimate the intrusive censorship practices of more digitally authoritarian governments. And I would argue that's one reason why, when President Obama was responding to the Russian information operation on the US presidential election, he referred to it as in violation of established international norms of behavior, studiously avoiding the language of international law. So that is our third area, cyber information operations, and I'll now move to conclude. So the basic point of my paper was to illuminate that silences are not uniform, but their underlying purpose, targets, and scope varies according to the security threat that we're dealing with, and that this is an important way to view how international law works in practice. So I'm going to skip through that just to give you the implications of my analysis, because I think that's important with my final few seconds. There are three implications to my paper. First, it illuminates an important dimension of the politics of international law. When states are silent on the international domain, that does not necessarily mean it's because there is no law or they're not sure what the law is. As I've tried to emphasize, it could be strategic, it could be for political reasons, it could be for evidential reasons. There are a whole host of reasons that motivate states' silences in different contexts. Relatedly, and this is an important point, state silence is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay? I think as international lawyers, we sometimes want states to come out in every context and clarify the law, but there may be things going on behind the scenes, and there may be legitimate reasons in terms of technical capacity, which mean that which motivate the state silences. So when we examine state silences going forward, I think we need to have a broader picture of the different factors that are at play. And the final implication is that I think this research project sets the foundations for a couple of extra research avenues for the future. And here I refer to, I'll put one forward, which is what inferences can we draw from state silences in terms of understanding the meaning of international law? In what contexts does the silence of a state inform the content of international law? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barry Sander, for this overview of state silences and the reasons behind it. If you're interested in more detail, please have a look at the proceedings of CyCon. And we have time for one quick question before, yes, please, here on the corner.
So I want to pick up on your last question, which was what can you infer from state silence? And in particular, what can you infer from the fact that basically nations haven't complained about cyber attacks as violations of international law? And are we creating, regardless of the reason of why they're silent, are we creating a legal regime which is essentially, international legal regime, which is essentially safe for a cyber attack to do?
Thank you for that question. It's a fantastic question. So I didn't have time to put it in the presentation. I'm really glad you asked that question. But what I would refer to, and I think it's a useful document, is the International Law Commission has released its draft conclusions on the identification of customary international law. And in draft conclusion 10, paragraph 3, it states, failure to react over time to a practice may serve as evidence of acceptance as law, opinio juris, provided that states were in a position to react and the circumstances called for some reaction. Now, breaking that down in the commentary, it then states that whether a state was in a position to react relies on knowledge, and knowledge can be assumed from circumstances, knowledge of the practice,